has that 25/3, but it does not quite have 100/20 megabits per second, which is actually the new definition of broadband. So that is the kind of speeds that we're reaching for everyone to have universally. And then a served location is a location that does have 100/20 megabits per second. So I will call out, even if the household does not subscribe to it, if it is available for that household to subscribe to, that household, based on the terms of this federal program, is considered served. Unserved and underserved locations are eligible for BEAD funding. Served locations are not. The final term here is a community anchor institution. So this is a term that we had to define through our process of getting approval to use these funds from the federal government. So it's an entity that facilitates the greater use of broadband service by vulnerable populations. I'm happy to share a more detailed definition, but think schools, libraries, hospitals, certain community support organizations, community spaces and public housing, things like that. Community anchor institutions that have less than 1 gigabit symmetrical service available are eligible for BEAD funds. And 1 gigabit just means 1,000/1,000 megabits per second. In the priority order, unserved locations are first, and then underserved, and then community anchor institutions. And the reason that we have to prioritize connecting these locations is because while we have a lot of funding to work with, a historic amount, we know it is not going to be enough to cover every single eligible location, and that's where that prioritization comes into play. So a little bit more about BEAD, Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. The goal of BEAD is to ensure universal coverage across all of those unserved and underserved locations. This program is administered through a federal agency within the Department of Commerce called NTIA, which stands for the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. So everything that we do kind of comes down from NTIA. We've had some opportunity to flesh out more detailed rules on the state level, so it makes sense for Illinois, but a lot of what we're doing is kind of pursuant to NTIA's requirements. So NTIA requires us to prioritize fiber projects and then consider non-fiber projects based on certain cost feasibility standards. We have to, again, prioritize unserved and underserved locations and then community anchor institutions. We have to meet a series of requirements that I'll talk through and then have 1 year to select all of the internet service providers who will get these funds to deploy service. And then there is a required affordable broadband package that will be built into all of the awards. So zooming out on, the map, who actually needs this connectivity? Why does this matter for Illinois? I think if you're here, you probably know, but can't say it enough. Internet, connection to the internet is really essential to participate in our digital economy, whether it's accessing mental health care services, seeing a doctor online, creating a resume on Microsoft Word, even, going through an online mentorship program, a training program, enrolling in classes. Internet is essential for all of these things. And so the goal is to make sure that no one is left behind. So what the BEAD funds will do is offer the opportunity for internet service providers to build connection to every household, to every location who does not have it. So by the end of the program, they will have at least one option to subscribe to. Looking at the numbers here, I'll talk a little bit about the challenge process, but we're looking at around 170,000 unserved and underserved locations that will kind of be prioritized for that BEAD process. I will say this number is subject to change as we finish up our challenge process and get approval from the federal government, but that is what we're looking at in this moment of time. So at the end of BEAD in 5 years, the goal is that those pink and blue numbers are down to close to zero. And I've received some questions about, I'm a resident, do I have to apply to take advantage of the BEAD funds? If I'm a local government, how does this work. So wanted to go into a little bit more detail about what are the BEAD funds actually funding. So a BEAD project will build or deploy broadband infrastructure to connect a home or a location to that high-speed internet. So here on the screen, you could see lots of examples of what that could look like. And so if you are a resident who lives in a home that is eligible, you really don't have to do anything. You will get service by the end of this program. So the real key is it's internet service providers or other entities who can deploy broadband either themselves or through a partnership who will be directly applying for and receiving these funds and then carrying out these builds. I will say some locations might have no technology, no infrastructure running to them now to provide broadband to the household where there might be net new construction needed. Others may have old technology or technology that Illinois doesn't consider adequate broadband, like DSL, for example, from legacy phone lines. And so in those cases, it could be a fresh new build, it could be an upgrade. So this slide just kind of reinforces that priority order. We've got a significant amount of funding, but we have got lots of locations, a lot of need. And so we'll follow this priority order to roll out these funds. So again, first is those unserved locations that'll be first in line, those that don't have any internet or who only have internet with speeds less than 25/3 Mbps. Unserved locations are second in line. These are locations that may have those 25/3 speeds, but lack access to anything above that. And then the third priority are those community anchor institutions that do not have gigabit service. You can see more examples on this slide. So these are certain government buildings, public safety, libraries, schools, and parks. So this is where it gets a little bit wonky and a little bit more detailed. So bear with me, and I'm gonna, keep it relatively high level here. It's a huge program, and it's a historic program. And so NTIA, the federal agency who is administering this program, wants to make sure that states get this right. And so with that, every state has had to go through a series of requirements. The most recent requirement was publishing what is called an initial proposal. So Illinois had to kind of map out, how do we actually want to select broadband providers to receive this funding? How do we want to score applications? What are we going to do to promote the subgrantee opportunity? What sort of outreach are we going to do? How long will we take? So everything that will kind of define the next year of this program is in a document called the Initial Proposal Volume 2. We sought approval and were, I think, the 10th state to receive approval of our Initial Proposal Volume 2. And what this unlocks is our ability to actually start our subgrantee selection process. So where we are now is we started running what's called a pre-qualification opportunity. So any applicant who's interested or who thinks they might be interested in applying for some of those BEAD funds can submit materials to us demonstrating that they are qualified to operate, run, build a broadband network. So that is where we are right now. And then the next step is to actually release that notice of funding opportunity and start accepting applications. So there's a couple of other things that have to happen before we do that, but looking at likely September. Then that will kick off a 1-year subgrantee selection process. What the subgrantee selection process means is we have this notice of funding opportunity out there. It's called a NOFO, similar to a request for proposals, if you're more familiar with that. And we'll be accepting applications in 3 waves, reviewing them, making provisional awards, and the map will kind of be, there will be areas of the map that will be claimed. So they'll be taken off the map. And so we'll winnow down those areas. And the goal is by the end of that selection process, all eligible Illinois locations will be accounted for. We submit that to NTIA, they give us approval, and then we can execute grant agreements and start the builds. So if you're tracking timelines, I would offer to have patience because this is a 5-year program. So following approval by NTIA, which would likely be sometime next summer, that will kick off a 4-year implementation of those projects. So I think this slide is really important, and it looks like we have a lot of different types of folks on this call. So I'm going to kind of go through different stakeholder groups and talk through how might BEAD affect you, and then what do you have to do, if anything, to make sure that you and your community are getting that benefit. So first, internet service providers. Internet service providers have to do the most right now because they are the ones who have to apply for the BEAD grant funds. So they should go through the pre-qualification process, and then they'll be preparing their applications to kind of claim different parts of the map that they believe they can cover. So they'll be the ones that will be applying for the grants directly. The next line is residents. So residents, at the end of the day, when the construction is done and the retail broadband service is available, will be able to subscribe to high-speed internet. So the goal is, if you don't have internet now, in 4 to 5 years, you will have that internet, hopefully sooner, knowing that construction could start as early as, the next year and a half. So you don't have to do anything, but I would say to spread awareness that this is coming. So residents can learn about providers who might be, exploring, deploying in their area. And it's good to know that, this investment is being made, and Illinois and the federal government is prioritizing connecting households to internet. Local governments can play a couple different roles here. So at minimum, they could play a similar role to residents and just sort of understand which locations are eligible, and then really just, sit back and the connections will come. But local governments are also encouraged to take a more active role. For example, maybe there are a couple different internet service providers who want to apply for funding to bring their service to your community. There is a scoring system when we review applications. And one section of that scoring system is called local coordination. So we'll actually award points to applications that demonstrate support from the local community. And that could be in the form of letters of support from local governments, small businesses, other leaders in the community, residents even, nonprofits, libraries, etc. There's also an opportunity to contribute financially or to allocate in-kind staff. So any evidence that you as a local government, a local community, feel like this is the provider that can support your community best, we would love to see your support. At the end of the day, there are lots of scoring criteria. We're looking at costs, we're looking at the experience, the technology that internet service provider will offer. So there are lots of considerations, but showing that local coordination could certainly push, 2 tied applications, push one over the edge if we can see that the community feels really good about this provider and what they're offering to the community, whether it's just aligned with values, community benefits agreements, or just, taking that extra step and reaching out to build that relationship. Final piece on local governments. So some local governments might want to be a part of an application themselves. It might be a public-private partnership. Perhaps the local government puts in funding. Perhaps they want to own an asset at the end of the day. So local governments are certainly encouraged to partner with internet service providers if they're interested in kind of taking the greatest step in being a part of these applications. Community organizations and nonprofits. I think this is probably most similar to residents. So you will benefit based on kind of that priority order. Providing letters of support for a provider that you're excited about is also encouraged. Also just raising awareness for the BEAD program among your residents so people know that this is coming. Lots of roles for community organizations. And finally, contractors. So if an internet service provider is planning on doing the work by way of bringing on contractors, so like subcontractors through the grant, contractors do not need to do anything at this point outside of making those connections with ISPs. They do not need to pre-qualify. However, I would just reinforce that this is an Illinois infrastructure project, so all workers need to be paid the prevailing wage. So this is something that contractors can start thinking about and make sure that they understand. And then those ISPs should make sure to be budgeting for the prevailing wage in the budgets that they submit. All right, so how will we actually administer BEAD in Illinois? Like I mentioned, our initial proposal, Volume 2, was approved on June 13th, which kind of gives us the green light to start our process. I talked a little bit about the challenge process, but to share a quick recap, so before we could even submit our final documents to NTIA, we had to undergo what was called the challenge process. So we published a map of what the current data said was the connectivity status for every location in the state. So there's this map that is, I believe, still up if you're interested in poking around. That should have every location, and then the current understanding of what internet service is available in terms of the provider, the speed, and the technology. During the challenge process, nonprofits, internet service providers, and local governments were encouraged to review the map, and if they saw anything that was incorrect or needed to be added, they could submit a challenge with evidence. And then that evidence was reviewed by the Office of Broadband and our merit review team. There was an opportunity for rebuttal. So providers could sort of see the challenges that might have been levied against them and respond accordingly with corresponding evidence. And where we are at in this process is wrapping up final adjudication, meaning making those final calls on what is the truth about every location, submitting that map to the federal government, and then awaiting approval so we can publish that updated map that shows the sort of final status of every location and its eligibility for BEAD funds. So that map is not available yet, still working behind the scenes. As soon as it is available, you will know. You'll get lots of emails from me and from our office. So this is just a high-level look at the timeline and where we are now, really in this pre-qualification process. So again, an entity like an internet service provider who is able to deploy broadband and offer broadband service, who's thinking of applying, should submit their pre-qualification materials so we can sort of give that green light that they, based on the information we get, are all good and eligible to apply for BEAD funds down the line. I'll go through these briefly since they get a little bit in the weeds, but there's kind of three elements to our sub-grantee process that could be helpful to be aware of. So as you saw, the numbers right now are saying around 170,000 locations that could be eligible for BEAD. That number could change, but as of right now, that is where we're at. It would be really challenging if we just put all of those 170,000 locations, up for grabs to applicants. It would be, difficult on the back end to kind of look at all the combinations of locations and make sure they're being doled out correctly. There would be a lot of overlap. And so to make this process more efficient, we are using an approach called project area units. These are essentially clusters of eligible locations clustered together based on their distance apart and accounting for geographic features like rivers or forests and even railroads and highways in some cases. And so where these project area units come into play is that when we publish the final map that shows which locations are eligible, which are not eligible, and in what order, those applying for BEAD funds can look at a map of all those project area units and essentially select them and kind of play around with, okay, if I want to do a project in this area with these project area units, and then I want to look at this area, we're building a tool so you can kind of select those to build your applications and apply for different areas. So this is just what it looks like on the screen. You can see on the right here, we have just an example image of what this concept of a project area unit is. So all of the dots represent those broadband serviceable locations, houses and businesses. You'll see some sort of differentiation between those that are unserved and those that are underserved. And then you can see these hexagons, which are what we use to, again, bring together those clusters. So when someone applies to serve a certain area, they have to kind of take all of the locations within the project area unit. They can't split it up. There could be one location in a project area unit. There could be 500. And that's just kind of depending on the density of the area. The second thing to just highlight about running that subgrantee selection process is that there will be between 2 and 3 waves. This means that we will kind of keep the application open, but be evaluating applications that we receive in 3 different groups. So the first wave will accept any application, but those that are sort of eligible to be awarded are those that are using fiber as their technology and include a sufficient amount of hard to serve project area units. We'll be defining what exactly hard to serve means, but thinking about those that are the least desirable from a business model. So communities that may not have had any broadband investment to date because the return on investment just isn't there. Maybe its houses are really spread apart. It's a geographically rough terrain and it might be more expensive. Perhaps there's railroads. So we're going to prioritize those first and offer up that subsidy to incentivize providers to come and serve those locations. Then in wave 2, we'll kind of make available any location that wasn't already provisionally awarded and open up the application process again for all areas and then all of the reliable broadband technologies. And then in wave 3, this is where we'll look at any areas that have not yet been bid on, and we'll work with internet service providers who might have applied in previous rounds to make sure that by the end of this, every area is claimed and has a provider who is getting awarded that funding to build broadband to those households. Final quick note here, I mentioned it briefly, is pre-qualification. So if you are an internet service provider or another type of organization who can deploy broadband and you may be interested in applying for BEAD, filling out our pre-qualification application is a great step to just get ahead of the game. The benefits are you'll know whether you're eligible sooner than later. You'll save some work down the line. And you'll have the opportunity to get feedback from our office early on your materials. So this is open through July 23rd. It is not required to participate, but strongly encouraged so we can kind of start our work together early and make the most use of our time. So we have lots of documents on pre-qualification that if this is relevant to you, I'm happy to go into this in more detail. All right, and finally, how can I get involved? So I think that slide I shared earlier with the table, kind of looking at who are you and then what do you have to do to benefit from BEAD is probably your best resource, but I'll share these kind of general opportunities to communicate. So we have a partner form. We also call it an intake form that we encourage you to fill out if you want to receive up-to-date communication about all things BEAD, digital equity, any programming related to our office. So I'll throw that in the chat and I highly encourage you to fill that out. And you can select kind of the type of organization you are, the region that you serve, and that'll help make sure that you get targeted and relevant communication to you. We're trying not to spam everyone, really want to make sure that we're making the best use of your time. For community leaders, organization, nonprofits, and local governments, we are trying to come up with the best process to link you up with providers who are interested in coming to your community. again, for that opportunity to provide letters of support. But we'd also love to support you in, asking the right questions, understanding how do I know if a provider is good for my community, what sort of technology is best for my needs. So I would say if that is of interest to you, stay tuned for a more formal process. But if you are a provider and you know that you're going into a certain community and you want connections, I would say to email us at broadband@illinois.gov, and we can help make those connections early on. And if you're a community who wants to get connected with providers, also shoot us an email. We're going to figure out the best way to streamline the process of making those connections. Let's see. Prepare to apply for round 4. So we'll be pushing out information, hosting webinars like this throughout the summer, fall, and really over the next year. And then we're really responsive over email. So broadband@illinois.gov is a great way to get your questions answered. Once we get closer to the application process opening, we'll have office hours where you can kind of workshop questions one-on-one. And then our website is where everything is stored. So with that, I will close out the presentation and would love to take any questions. I'm looking in the chat here, so let me catch up.
Thanks, Devin. The first question came in about 12:14. I think it came from Jerry. I think it got answered in the course of the information that followed. Where and when will the money be released? I think you covered that in your timeline pretty well.
Got it. Yes. Well, just to kind of recap on that, I'll pull up the timeline again. I think this is probably a good one. So like I mentioned, Jerry, there are a series of steps that we have to go through to kind of get our plans approved by NTIA to start our subgrantee process. So if we start opening up the application process in September, we will have until, roughly early summer of next year to make those decisions and then award provisional winners. Then we have to get approval from the federal government and execute grant agreements. So it's hard to say, but perhaps, early winter of 2025 to 2026 is when those projects would actually be starting. So I'm glad you've heard of it. And now hopefully this is a good insight into kind of the steps that we have to go through.
Next one, a little bit related, came in just a few minutes later from the mayor of Bellflower. We've been approached by a provider saying that they have been funded and plan to start installing fiber later this month or next. From this, it sounds like the funding hasn't been done yet.
Yeah. So we are lucky because BEAD is not the first broadband program here in Illinois. So the Connect Illinois program, rounds 1 through 3, has been rolling for a couple of years now. So the office has made lots of awards this winter and spring. So there are a lot of projects starting now. And so, Mayor, if you want to shoot me an email, I can connect you with the provider or offer more details. But that's great. If a project was funded using other sources prior to BEAD, that'll just help the process go even faster.
One question that rolled in directly was, I understand that BEAD grants may be federally taxable to the recipient. Is this understanding still correct? That may go beyond the scope of our inquiry today, but I'll toss it out there, see what you have to say.
Yeah, I would say if you could email that to broadband@illinois.gov, I want to make sure I consult with our legal team to get you the right information.
Next question up. Andriana asks, if a provider approaches our area and they are accepted into the program, will that provider also be able to service residents who would like to change their service provider? In other words, does this have the potential to generate competitive services?
Yeah, thanks for this question, Andriana. It depends. So if a location, and it kind of goes back to that priority, here you go, this priority order. So if a location already has qualifying broadband service, meaning the provider offers 100 over 20 megabits per second Mbps speeds or greater, um, using a reliable broadband technology is defined by the federal government. So that could be fiber, cable, hybrid of the two, um, licensed fixed wireless, or something called licensed by rule fixed wireless, which is a combination of licensed and unlicensed spectrum. Getting into the weeds there. So if it already has that service available, it likely won't be eligible for BEAD, and so would not have a sort of competing option. However, if that location has only 25 over 3 service, or something not quite 100 over 20, or might claim 100 over 20, but it is not one of those reliable technologies. So let's say it's DSL, then there could potentially be competition, and you'll have that choice between the two providers, the existing one or the one funded by BEAD. I will say, like, the intent or the strategy of the BEAD program is to really fill in those gaps where there is no service or no broadband service per their definitions, not necessarily to create that choice and competition, which I know has its other benefits for affordability. That's just kind of how the program was designed.
Good, thank you. I have another question. How can we get a listing of the CAI offices,
Yeah.
locations?
So we had published a list of all of the community anchor institutions during the challenge process, and then accepted challenges that may have said this actually is a house, not a CAI, or this should be labeled as a CAI. So we will have an updated list and be publishing that, I think, when we publish that final map. So it is not available yet, but it will be.
Good, work in progress. Okay. Um, Next question, what is the match required by the state or ISP and how is that handled? I believe 25% project value was discussed earlier on.
Yeah. So the program requires a 25% match. We're going to be publishing more information on what that match could look like. It's not necessarily a cash match. I think a cash match is great, but we understand that different providers are different sizes and have different level of resources. So there's in-kind support, there's community bond proceeds, bank loans. So more information coming on that. But yes, 25% match. There's also certain conditions where a provider could seek a match waiver. That those details will also be released.
And I think that also covers a follow-up question that Evan posed about knowing how to address the question of showing a 25% match when they don't know what their bid will be yet.
Yeah, let me look for that one. What time was that one? Or can you read it again?
Came in at 12:35 from Evan.
Yeah, I think same answer applies.
Okay. By registering, no, yes, we'll take this one. By registering for the webinar, are we automatically enrolled to receive updates, or do we have to go to the link and enroll as a partner?
I would suggest enrolling separately. We are lucky to have this partnership with the University of Illinois, but we do have a separate email list specific to our office's updates. So I'll go ahead and put that link in the chat and would encourage you to fill it out right now. And then you can make sure to get all of our communication.
There you go. And that addresses Windy City SDR's comment as well. Rod poses the question, apologies if you answered, but for round one, what is, quote, sufficient, unquote, hard to serve areas? How many hard to serve PAUs will be required for a round one application?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that we're kind of building out as we speak. So there are certain parameters and rules for the program that the federal government set, certain ones that Illinois already established through its initial proposal, volume 2. And now our task is to fill in those additional details. So in progress and more to come on what that sufficient term is defined as.
And a related question in terms of, okay, you've just answered it, how that is defined. Rod had followed up with the question about hard to serve area, the definition being based on the cost per premise.
Sorry, I'm trying to follow along with you in the questions.
1240.
Yeah. So what constitutes a hard to serve area? Got it. A hard to serve area. So again, it'll be a calculation based on previous demand that we've seen for that area from providers, like previous interest from the existing Connect Illinois grant program. It'll be looking at the poverty rate at the county level, the density of the area. Essentially, if there are, enough data points that tell us that this is not that this is going to be an area that might be hard to get a provider there, it's likely to be, prioritized and considered that hard to serve area.
Good. That was pretty much it for the questions so far. If you've got another moment or so, if anybody else wants to pose another question, ask for some more clarification. In the meantime, again, I will repeat, if you are participating today in the webinar because someone shared the link with you, but would like to register for future webinars, please drop your email into the chat. Also, that will make sure that you get the materials, the slide deck, as well as a link to the recording from today's presentation.
And I see the question about how will we be notified when the CAI listing is published.
Okay.
So this will all be a part of that final map that shows the eligibility of every location. Your best bet is signing up for that bit.ly/IOB partner, and you will receive communication through there. We will be spreading that far and wide when that map is available, because that means it is go time. And I see some folks putting their emails in the chat. We'll still want you to fill out the intake form, at least for the broadband office's communications. We'll learn a little bit about you, like the communities you serve, your region, type of organization, etc. And again, let me just throw in, so broadbands at illinois.gov. This is where you can reach out with any questions. To be connected with providers, we're building a big contact base, so we want to play that matchmaker role as best as we can, and ultimately figure out, a more systemic, efficient way to make those connections. But we're still thinking on that. So if you have ideas, don't hesitate to reach out.
Terrific. Any final questions or comments? Well, Devin,